Hi, everybody. My name's Andrew Defty. I'm an Associate Professor of Politics here at the University of Lincoln, and I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight to the very first Brian Winston Memorial Lecture, supported by Dale and Co. Brian is a much respected, much missed, and in my own experience, somewhat mischievous colleague, but also someone I think we could do with around to talk about events, particularly around this weekend. I'm personally delighted, though, to be able to welcome our guest speaker this evening, the documentary maker Michael Cockerell. Michael has done for the British political system what David Attenborough has done for the natural world. And I'm inclined to think that sometimes their subject matter has been very similar indeed. Michael's work has been a fixture of my teaching for many years, and indeed Michael's documentary series, Inside the Commons, is required viewing. I'm going to hand over now to the head of the School of Film, Media and Journalism, Mette, to introduce, say a few words about Brian and to introduce Michael. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. It is truly an honour to say a few words about Professor Brian Winston, the Lincoln professor. It is fitting that Professor Winston's towering presence should be evoked in a memorial lecture by a speaker as eminent as Michael Cockerell, whom I look forward to introducing very soon. But first, a few words about Professor Winston. As a relatively new head of the School of Film, Media and Journalism, I did not have the good fortune to work closely with Brian, although our paths did cross happily at various international events. This evening, then, I would like to be a conduit for some of the nuanced and telling stories that colleagues have shared with me. In reading these stories, I was struck by some recurring themes. First, the teacher who changed lives. Senior lecturer Dr. Zara Healy remembers Brian as follows, quote, "Brian took over as my PhD supervisor in 2019 at a time when I lacked a lot of confidence and felt like I should give up. He was an exacting and demanding supervisor who did not suffer fools, but he also did not stand on ceremony. He would always treat my ideas kindly, and even when I lost my nerve or got overwhelmed, he was very encouraging and made me believe I could do it and praised my ideas to others, so I gradually did feel more self-assured." Sarah continues, "Brian told me once that a Jewish refugee arrived at his secondary school in London, and to pay his debt back to Britain for giving him sanctuary during the Second World War, the refugee began coaching the pupils on how to get into Oxbridge. He did this for years, and this intervention enabled Brian to get into Oxford to study law. Brian believed that this was very important in opening up a new world to him, developing his intellect, horizons and opportunities, and he was always very grateful. In turn, Zara says, Brian then helped me with his confidence in me. We all need someone like Brian." End quote. The second theme, the kind colleague who took a real interest in people. Senior lecturer Jack Shelburne, who is helping us tonight, says, quote, "The last time I saw him, I was walking past his house by the cathedral with Sophie and our newborn daughter, Sylvie. It was a month or so before he passed, and he looked frail compared to any moment before that. He spotted us and called us over right away. He was being helped into a car by a friend who was taking him to hospital. But despite the friend's suggestion they needed to get going, he insisted on seeing our daughter. He always spoke so lovingly about children and his grandchildren. It was a very Brian thing to do, to make sure he got to see our daughter in that moment." End of quote. In a similar vein, senior lecturer Dr. Mikey Murray says, quote, "My memories of Brian were of how generous he was as a colleague with his time and experience. When I first came to the university nearly 10 years ago, Brian was one of the first to invite me for a post-work drink. He wanted to know all about me and what my plans were with my practice. He always encouraged me to pursue my filmmaking as the priority and was first in line to buy a share in the film mindset, for which he gave me a check. I loved Brian because despite his giant stature as an academic, he sought to understand everyone's individual passions and strengths." End of quote. The theme of the kind colleague continues in the memories of Deputy Head of School John Cafferty, who says, quote, "Brian loved children and he struck up a remarkable friendship with my youngest son, Frankie. I'll always remember going to a party in a large garden and watching Brian play hide and seek with Frankie for hours, rather than engage with the grown-ups at the party." End of quote. Senior lecturer Luke Pieknet recalls how Brian, quote, "had a very respectful way of bestowing a sense of importance and responsibility upon people." End of quote. The third theme, a man whose brilliance was ever humane. John Cafferty recalls how, quote, "Brian was always the brightest person in the room, but never made you feel intellectually inferior. He just included you in his conversations." End quote. Professor Jane Chapman also remembers Brian as, quote, "a big thinker with the polished brain of a lawyer, Oxford Law as first degree, but also as hugely excitable and enthusiastic and always outspoken. The discussions that he provoked were lively and much fun, something our students also experienced." End quote. The fourth theme, the filmmaker and scholar of global stature who connected the University of Lincoln to a wider world. With no direct acquaintance with Brian, Associate Professor Dr. Philip Warnell, Program Leader for Film Production, recalls his experience last summer of discovering Brian's legacy in China. Brian had played a key role in a program called Looking China, with which we have recently reconnected, thanks to colleagues in the role. Brian also recruited sizable numbers of Chinese students to the University of Lincoln. They would spend their summers here, enrolled in our summer schools, where they learned all about documentary filmmaking. Recalling his first visit to Beijing Normal University this last summer, Philip Warnell says, quote, "Working in Beijing, I was struck by how many lives Brian had touched on many levels. His dynamic impact was self-evident." End of quote. The fifth theme, the practitioner scholar who changed how we think about documentary filmmaking. Let me conclude with some recollections from senior lecturer Chris Hainstock, who was the film editor for Brian Winston's remarkable film, A Boatload of Irishmen, about the filmmaker and father of the documentary, Robert Flaherty. Chris Hainstock says, quote, "A boatload of wild Irishmen shrewdly looked beyond standard polemical positions to present a complex view of Robert Flaherty, the man, and his work. Brian himself interviewed contributors, including cinematographer Ricky Leacock during a talk at the University of Lincoln, and Flaherty's Inuit granddaughter Martha, the granddaughter of Naila in Nanook of the North. Brian also interviewed many scholars in the UK and America. The film was funded by TV4 in Ireland and European Media Fund, and was a university co-production." Chris continues, "Brian was passionate about the film, which drew heavily on his academic research into the documentary form. Brian said, Flaherty was the first to work out how to transform film of real people going about their everyday lives from mere shapeless surveillance camera observation into a dramatic, enthralling narrative. And that, in essence, is what documentary is. This was a brilliant breakthrough, but it can cause real moral dilemmas." And that's the end of Brian's quote and also the end of Chris Hainstock's message. Brian's loss has left a great void in the university and particularly in the School of Film, Media and Journalism. He will always be held in the very highest regard by his colleagues, whose love and affection for him live on in the stories, the many, many stories we love to tell about Brian. Just how keenly his loss is felt is movingly captured by Dr. Zara Healy, who continued to copy Brian after his death into her emails about her dissertation. As she puts it, I thought he still deserved to be included. Let me now turn to my introductory words about our speaker, Michael Cockerell. An award-winning documentary maker, Michael Cockerell has filmed and interviewed 10 prime ministers over the years. In this public lecture this evening, he will tell the tragicomic inside story of the battle for control between the PMs and the broadcasters. He will reveal how the two sides have become increasingly savvy and sophisticated, with each accusing the other of dirty tricks and fake news. Michael Cockerell has been a BBC TV political reporter and documentary maker for 50 years, winning a string of awards for his witty and eye-opening profiles of our prime ministers and other top politicians. You are no one in British politics until Ewan Cockerell wrote one newspaper. And Rory Bremner said, quote, Michael Cockerell is the day at Edinburgh of the political animal kingdom, endlessly fascinating, as we already heard. Michael is an honorary fellow of his Oxford College, Corpus Christi, and was for 10 years visiting professor of politics at Nottingham University. He's a regular radio broadcaster and writes for The Times, Daily Mail, The Guardian, and The Spectator. His latest book is called Unmasking Our Leaders. At the end of his lecture, Michael will take questions from the audience. Michael's talk is entitled Prime Ministers in TV, the Love-Hate Relationship. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker to the University of Lincoln.
Well, thank you very much for that obituary. It was great. So after what you said, I can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. But you can come to my funeral, and it's like being in the coffin listening to it. Thank you very much. I knew Brian for almost all my life. We first met 70 years ago when we were 11, starting out at our Northwest London grammar school. And our careers and lives were often to interweave from then on. Even at the tender age of 15, Brian had many of the characteristics he was to retain to the end of his life. He was not a tall boy, but what he lacked in inches, he made up in intellect. He was very clever, but had an extraordinarily well-stocked mind and could never stop talking. I don't think that changed. We used to call him the professor. That was when he was at school. He was fascinated by cinema, and he set up the school film society. Each month he would arrange screenings of legendary films from the past. He started with Birth of a Nation, made in 1915, about the American Civil War, which became the first blockbuster film. The following month he came up with The Battleship Potemkin, made by the Soviet-Russian filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein in 1925. They were both black and white, silent movies, but Brian made up for the lack of soundtrack by providing his own fascinating commentary about the making of the films. At Kilburn Grammar School, we were both inspired by the wonderful history teacher that has just been mentioned. He was called Dr. Walter Isaacson. He was a German Jewish refugee, and he made history come alive and taught us how to think for ourselves. And he helped Brian and me get into Oxford. We went to neighbouring colleges and would see each other regularly. I'm going to cut a lot of the next bit out because we've had a lot about Brian, and I would jump to the last email he sent me. Over the years, we used to, our paths often crossed, and what he did, I did, and what I did, he did. For instance, he became a professor, I became an honorary professor. I won an Emmy, he won an Emmy the next year. It was a fascinating thing, and we would keep in touch the whole time until the very end. And I looked at the last email he wrote to me. He said, "Rather to my surprise, I've been in Lincoln for the last 20 years, scribbling away and helping build the university. I'm still on the books full time," he said. He was 80. "It's been fun, and living opposite the front door of the cathedral is really a joy. If we are spared, or actually sooner than that, it would be lovely to meet up again." Sadly, we never did. My lecture today is on a subject that I feel Brian would have approved, the tragicomic relationship over the years between our prime ministers and television. Every modern prime minister has either loved, or hated, or feared television, and some have done all three. All have wanted to use it to polish their images and spin their achievements. Like most politicians, they've spent a lifetime putting on the gloss. I've spent a lifetime trying to scrape it off. I've been lucky enough to make many TV documentaries about our prime ministers. I've also written a book which you'll be able to purchase afterwards. The unsigned ones will be the rare ones, but I will sign them if you want them. It's called Unmasking Our Leaders, Confessions of a Political Documentary Maker. Tonight I want to tell you about what our prime ministers are really like behind the scenes and how the perennial battles between Number 10 and the broadcasters have been fought. And I'll be showing you some candid clips from my films, some never seen publicly before. So let me start in 1961. The BBC, with its great fondness for anniversaries, was celebrating the 25th anniversary of the start of television in Britain. It had laid on a glittering banquet in the Grand Hall in the City of London. The guest of honour was the Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan. The great and the good, from Lord Reith to the Archbishop of Canterbury, were all invited. And in those more self-confident days of the BBC, it was an occasion where white ties and decorations, medals were worn. In his after-dinner speech, Macmillan reflected on the effect that television was having on his life as Prime Minister. In those days, the TV cameras would always film the Prime Minister when business took him to foreign countries.
It is in airports that television chooses to lurk. You go by sea, you go by road, you go by rail, nobody bothers you very much. But if you go by air, there it is, that hot, pitiless, probing eye. After 14 hours of travel, you get off the aeroplane wanting only a shave and a bath. Oh no, you are cornered. The lights in your eyes, the camera's whizzing. You put up your hand to shade your eyes. And the next day, there you are, in the Daily Clarion, looking weary, old, worried, over a caption which implies that you are past it.
He was a master. He could have been an actor. He was, and his tone of voice and everything like that, knowing where the camera was, all that. Because he said to me when I asked him about television, he said, I hate it. I saw myself the first time on television, and I looked like a skeleton looking through the bars of a prison. So he said that he didn't want to do television ever again. But things changed, and he became a master of television. As he put it to me, we old dogs have to learn new tricks. I think most of his successors would recognise that speech he made. He was the first Prime Minister to try to come to terms with television. His predecessors, Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee, laughed at the idea that television could be had any part to play in politics. Churchill said it had no part to play. It was just, as he put it, it's just a tuppenny halfpenny Punch and Judy show. And when he returned to power in 1951, he never gave a TV interview and didn't ever want to appear on television. But as television audiences grew and grew, especially with the coronation, everyone was buying sets TV sets they didn't have before. Churchill reluctantly decided that he should have his own TV screen test made privately by a woman called Winifred Crum Ewing, who was she was the broadcasting officer of Conservative Central Office, and she filmed this screen test, and it was kept under lock and key for many, many years until when I was making a film about prime ministers and television, and Mrs. Crum Ewing was in hospital. She told me about it, and she said, "You seem like a nice young man." Shows how long ago it was. If I give you these keys and tell you my address, you go up to the first floor, and under the bed you will find a TV screen test that Winston Churchill made. So we went to the house and found this. It was an obsolete can of 35mm film, but we found somewhere to show it, and it hasn't really been shown on television again. And Mrs. Crum Ewing showed him the screen test, and he ordered her to destroy it. But she thought it was a historical document and kept it under her bed for the next 30 years until we found it. People talk about communists at the BBC. This is communists under the bed. Churchill never, as I said, gave a prime minister, gave an interview on television, but things were changing very fast. In 1963, Harold Wilson was the Labour leader of the opposition, and he'd made a study of television techniques. He sought to play up a modern, classless image in complete contrast to those like the new Tory Prime Minister who came after Macmillan, the upper-class Sir Alec Douglas-Home, who Wilson felt the Tory leaders, there'd been 3 who'd gone to Eton in a row, and the one before that was Churchill, who went to Harrow. Wilson said these people thought they were born to rule. So instead, Wilson saw himself as the British version of the charismatic American president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
And the new president's progress was closely monitored across the Atlantic by the Labour Party leader. Harold Wilson, who used to holiday on the Scilly Isles, presented himself as the British JFK. Like Kennedy, Wilson saw TV as a way of reaching voters direct and bypassing the right-wing press.
What I think we're going to need is something like what President Kennedy had when he came in after years of stagnation in the United States. He had a program of 100 days of dynamic action.
The Tory Prime Minister, Sir Alec Douglas-Home, an old Etonian, was Harold Wilson's opponent in the 1964 general election.
My cameraman colleagues have asked me if you'll give one wave on the steps, sir. If I duck out of the way.
Home had renounced his hereditary earldom to become Prime Minister. Harold Wilson had been to the White House to see Kennedy, hoping to catch some of the president's stardust. Claiming to represent the future like JFK, Wilson challenged Home to the first ever TV election debate in Britain.
Have you decided, Prime Minister, whether to take part in some kind of television debate or confrontation with Mr. Wilson during the election campaign?
My first reaction to this is that a British election is something in which something over 600 constituencies have to decide the issues, and the issues are issues of policy. and therefore I'm not particularly attracted by, so to speak, confrontations of personality. If we aren't careful, you know, you'll get a sort of, what's it called, top of the pops contest. I dare say I should win it, I'm not sure.
Yes, it's number one. It's top of the pops.
I'm not really very much attracted by this. You'll first then get the best actor as leader of the country, and the actor will be prompted by a scriptwriter. I'd rather have our old ways, really, and put our policies firmly in front of our people.
But if you decline Mr. Wilson's challenge, and after all, debate is between personalities is in the great British political tradition, might it not look as if you were running away?
Oh, no, I don't think so. After all, I debated Mr. Wilson in Parliament. But I shall decide if I want to confront Mr. Wilson, not Mr. Wilson if he wants to confront me.
About a week ago, I saw the Prime Minister on television. It's a fact, I did. I'm just as much allowed to watch television as any of you. I have my favourite programmes as you have. And this wasn't one of them.
Again, like Harold Macmillan, the timing is absolutely perfect. And it's quite interesting also that in 1948, when he became the youngest cabinet minister as president of the Board of Trade, a guy called Gerald Kaufman, who was at Oxford at that time, and invited Wilson down to the Oxford Labour Club, said that he was the most boring speaker he had ever seen, and no jokes. And he said that Wilson spent the next years teaching himself a sense of humour and also comic timing. And he won the 1964 election, beating Alec Douglas Hume by a majority of just 4 seats. And it was clear there would have to be a second election very soon. And the Tories decided that they would have to have a new leader to match Wilson's TV performance skills. After 3 old Etonian Tory leaders in a row, the party decided to choose the first working-class leader, Ted Heath. He was the son of a builder and a lady's maid, and a grammar school boy like Wilson. He was seen as the man for the job, but Heath proved no match for Wilson on television in the 1966 general election.
Heath was beaten in the election by a landslide, and Conservatives claimed he'd lost because he was a disaster on television. He watched a report from the once flattering Panorama which showed that nobody loves a loser.
Months of adverse polls have not helped Edward Heath surmount his apparent distaste for grassroots politicking. He tries very hard, like a sensitive man in a butcher shop, to conceal a faint nausea, still pasting on a grin, laughing a little too determinedly at all the fleshy cordiality.
But in politics today, the television image appears to be far more important than a man's ability.
Heath witnessed his own trial by television as Tory after Tory attacked him.
I think it's just Mr. Wilson's homely attitude on television, and Mr. Heath to them doesn't have the same appeal on television as they do.
When Hume was replaced by Heath, it was said, well, we'll have Heath, God knows we can't have anyone worse than Hume. Well, we've got someone worse than Hume.
But how low does your personal rating among your own supporters have to go before you consider yourself a liability to the party you lead?
Well, popularity isn't everything. In fact, it isn't the most important thing. What matters is doing what you believe to be right.
When you were leader of the opposition, many people say that what they found difficult was that you, as you really are, would never come across on television.
That's my fault, isn't it? That I wasn't able to project myself, if you like, through television screen. But that is something which some people are good and some people aren't.
Ted Heath saw Harold Wilson as a slick and untrustworthy performer, guided by media advisors and image makers. He set his face against any attempts to change his image. But by the time of the 1970 general election, he'd done his first U-turn. He allowed a team of advertising men, along with the film director Brian Forbes, to make a fly-on-the-wall election broadcast, which sought to turn his negative image into a positive asset.
Cold, aloof, distant. These were the kind of words the press were always ready to trot out about Ted Heath. But as the election got into its stride, they began to use them less. Heath was a man come to life and clearly enjoying himself. And then, as the days shortened, his message began to get through. Or perhaps it's the quality of the man that's begun to get through. People have begun to realize that this isn't just another politician talking. Perhaps he's not an easy man to know, but when they know him, people feel he's a man worth knowing, a man to trust.
Brilliant piece of film made by Brian Forbes, that cross-cutting. He followed him, with the new lightweight cameras on the election trail, and the commentary. Can anyone in the room recognise the voice of that commentator who did it very well? I'll give you a clue. He was a very famous athlete, and also a Tory MP, and also a newsreader. Christopher Chataway, well done. And so you could see that broadcast, which I thought was brilliantly made for what it was trying to do, and saying those words, cold, aloof, over all the cheering. It was very cleverly made. And it went out 2 days before the election, that broadcast, and was watched by 10 million people. And the BBC's audience research and the Tories' private opinion poll showed that the Heath broadcast was far better received than Harold Wilson's the following night. Heath received the highest rating for honesty, the quality most valued by the electorate in the surveys, while Wilson's was the lowest. And when the voters went to the polls, and to general astonishment, Heath, who'd been well behind throughout the campaign, won the election, demolishing Wilson's nearly 100-seat majority.
Heath had become Prime Minister with the help of the most sophisticated television campaign ever seen until that time in Britain.
Can we hear your formal claim to thank all my party workers?
Heath had accepted the painful necessity of deploying the latest techniques of television commercials during the election campaign, but he distrusted them and felt they had no place in government. Once he got to Downing Street, to the delight of his top civil servants, he slammed the door in the face of his media advisors.
Well, at that time they distrusted us very deeply. I think they thought we were practicing some version, ill-concealed really, of the black art. The manipulators, the persuaders, the Madison Avenue hucksters, all those phrases we used a great deal. And the phrase which you still hear, selling politicians like a packet of detergent or a bar of soap, as if that were a very bad thing.
So you didn't have any time for real image building?
No, on the contrary, this was the kind of phrase which we didn't particularly like.
Why not?
And indeed, I think that if somebody made a suggestion in some discussion, there might be a comment from somewhere in the room, oh, but that would look like image building. This was something which faces had been set against.
Heath consciously avoided interviews in television studios, which he felt degenerated into inquisitions. Instead, he held grand televised press conferences in the style of General de Gaulle of France. He seemed to believe that he could address the viewers at home as if they were a public meeting.
We had consultations, you will remember, through the summer with the CBI and the TUC.
Mr. Heath thought that the essence of presenting government's policy was in setting out what the position was as clearly and as fully as possible, set out the evidence, and then let the people judge.
It takes a bit more than that. If people don't get what you said, if it isn't projected properly, no matter how worthy your intentions, it doesn't count.
As the trade unions reacted violently against new laws to curb their powers, bloody scenes now took the place of the Prime Minister's lofty pronouncements. At the end of 1973, he announced a 3-day week to counter the miners' strike. Heath now tried to use television to unite the nation, and his friends claim he would have succeeded had he only been able to project his private charm onto the screen.
But you quote there about charm and so on. Well, if you've got a miners' strike going on, you don't go on television and to ooze charm, do you? The unanswered question.
The unanswered question, he said. I made this film about him, and he was a sort of semi-joy to film. He was so difficult to interview. I remember one day he came to do an interview, and he said to me, "Oh, do you have the usual list of boring questions?" I said, "Yeah, I'm afraid so." And the interview went a bit better than usual. I said, "Did you think the questions were as boring as usual?" He said, "Oh, yes, but infinitely more irrelevant today." And another time he said, "I've been thinking about you on the way here. Do you have any training for this kind of thing?" I said, "No, not at all." And I said exactly the opposite of what I do. I said, I don't do any background work. I don't look at any speeches or any articles you may have written or talk to anyone. I just come and sit here and ask the first question that comes into my head. He said, "Oh, that would account for it." When I told his private secretary this, he said, "Oh, well, if he's rude to you, it means he likes you." He must have liked me a lot. He fought the February '74 general election with a Who Rules Britain campaign. This was after the miners, or the miners' strike, the middle of the miners' strike, and the 3-day week. And the answer to Who Rules Britain from the public was, "Not you, matey," as Wilson returned to power to run a minority government, and Wilson won a second general election in October '74 with a tiny overall majority. But Heath refused to resign as Tory leader. None of his cabinet was prepared to challenge him for the leadership until the grocer's daughter from Grantham decided she had to do so. To most people's surprise, Margaret Thatcher beat Heath for the leadership, and the party's first woman leader was to have many battles about her TV image over the years, sometimes with me. I made a number of films about her. Here is one, called The Making of the Iron Lady. If you watch closely, you might recognize a youngish reporter with a full head of hair.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Who do we want? Who do we need? Who is the leader who really can lead Maggie Thatcher? It's Maggie for me.
Strong as a rock, straight as a dime.
You might find it a bit difficult to believe, but that's the official Conservative campaign song for the general election. You might find it a bit difficult to believe, but that was me 25 years ago, making a film about Margaret Thatcher. The story of her time inside Number 10 has often been told, but tonight I'll be telling the far less familiar story of how she managed to fight her way to the top in a man's world to become the West's first ever female Prime Minister.
Who has the drive? Who's gonna bring this old country alive?
Maggie Thatcher. It's Thatcher for me.
2, 3, 4. Thatcher, Thatcher, Thatcher. Not a man around to match her.
Do you have any doubts at all about your ability to measure up to the job of Prime Minister?
Do I have that? Well, I look at some of the other people, and I really... Of course you have doubts. Of course you have doubts. And you're tremendously aware of the responsibility. But I just haven't come to this out of the blue.
Finchley Central is 2 and 6pence from Golders Green on the Northern Line.
Finchley in North London first elected Margaret Thatcher as its MP in the 1959 general election. It had taken her 10 years and numerous rejections before she found a winnable seat, for the odds were stacked against female politicians. And when the new member for Finchley took her seat, she found she was one of only 12 Tory women, while there were 350 Conservative male members. She appeared in an ITV programme called The Trouble with Men.
Men are the world's leaders, demanding jobs that require only the best, the finest, and the most enlightened men. A few women have managed to scramble under the crushed barriers and join in the business of looking after England. One of them is Margaret Thatcher.
Well, we have to remember, as far as the British Parliament is concerned, that there are still only 25 women members out of a total of some 630 members of Parliament. So it's still not easy even to get elected as a woman member of Parliament.
That voice, so I am her grocer father, who wanted her to do well, arranged for her to have elocution lessons to lose her Grantham accent. And that voice in a sort of made the Queen sound like steptones or something. So polished. And when she became leader, her spin doctor said all the private opinion polls said, you've got to change your voice. You don't look as if you are any way in touch with ordinary people. He was a guy called Gordon Rees, and he'd been a TV producer and an advertising man. And he said to Mrs. Thatcher that he would take her in hand and change her image.
Gordon was absolutely terrific. He knew exactly what needed to be done, and he understood that it wasn't enough to have the right policies. One had to look good in putting them over, and he said my hair had to be changed, and we'd better have a look at the makeup, and we'd better have a look at the clothes, and see how they looked on television and so on.
And it's not quite smooth on the top.
I hadn't taken any notice of these things before.
Rees also arranged for her to go on telegenic factory visits and told her to bin the big hats.
There we are.
Radio Blackburn, the Lancashire sound on the air.
To show she was in touch with ordinary people, he advised her to appear on local radio, to court the tabloid press and make guest appearances on popular TV shows. On Radio Blackburn, Mrs. Thatcher chose a favourite record.
Two brothers fighting on opposite sides, and one sees the other.
I hadn't heard
Did
that.
you think I'd leave you dying when there's room on my horse for two?
Two little boys had two little toys. Each had a wooden horse. Gaily they played each summer's day. Warriors.
Go over there like that. You go over there like that. You come here like this. Right. Now then, you can knock on the door.
Hello, welcome. Come in.
I must introduce all our friends.
I'm Lucy. You're Lucy. Welcome, Lucy, dear. Come in and go and sit down.
I'm Alice.
Alice, and where are you from, Alice? Hailing Island.
Whenever I've played that so everyone goes exactly as it. It is extraordinary, isn't it? And it's not gratuitous by me, because Mrs. Thatcher appeared on Jim Will Fix It 3 times. She used to invite him to Chequers for Christmas, and she gave him a knighthood. So that clip that you see is, along with all the other broadcasts with Jimmy Savile that she did, buried now in the BBC's Black Vault. Those of you are privileged to see it, if that's the word. I mean, she, as well as being advised by Gordon Rees to go on programs which are not panorama, programs which lots of people would see, people who weren't necessarily interested in politics, she also she also used the big formal set-piece interview in the studio, often with either Brian Winston or Robin Day, and you've seen a number of shots of Robin already. And she regarded these encounters as highly significant, and much tension would surround them. The following clip has never been broadcast. The time is 1983 general election, a year after the Falklands, and Robin Day is in Downing Street for his big campaign interview with the Prime Minister. So I got this recording because I was working on Panorama with Robin at that time, and we knew that he went to Downing Street and that they were going to record the interview during the election, and they were playing it down the line to us in Lime Grove, the famous centre of current affairs television in Britain. And I saw that was happening, and I quickly got myself a VHS, put it in the machine, and recorded it. And neither of them knew that it was being recorded. I think they went to their graves without seeing that clip. I did once ask Mrs. Thatcher what she thought of those big set-piece interviews, and she said, "I hate them. I hate them. I hate them." And she would spend a long time preparing with her spin doctor, Bernard Ingham, and sometimes with Gordon Rees as well, for these big interviews. I remember Robin going off to do one of those interviews, and he said to me, "Michael, why don't I start the interview with the Prime Minister? Prime Minister, what's your answer to my first question?" Because he knew whatever he asked, she'd have been prepped by these people to give the soundbite that she wanted to answer. I said, "You should," but he never did, sadly. When Tony Blair became Labour leader at the age of 41, he wanted to convince voters that what his spin doctor, Alistair Campbell, called mad old Labour, was gone forever. Blair learnt a great deal from the media techniques of his friend, the American president, Bill Clinton. Clinton won power as a new Democrat, and Blair was the first leader of New Labour. In the years since then, there'd been a remarkable cross-pollination between the two Oxford-educated lawyers. Sometimes it was Clinton who would come up with the phrases first.
Opportunity and responsibility, they go hand in hand.
And in return for those opportunities, responsibility.
Not bigger government, but more effective government.
Not bigger government, better government.
New ideas for new challenges.
New challenges, new ideas.
It wasn't just a one-way process. Sometimes Blair would think of the line first.
At the time of the next election, there will be just 1,000 days until the new millennium. 1,000 days to prepare for 1,000 years.
Tomorrow there will be just over 1,000 days until the year 2000. 1,000 days to build a bridge to a land of new promise. Let us seize those days and the century.
Yeah, it shows how modest Clinton was. Blair wanted 1,000 years, a 1,000-year Reich, and Clinton only wanted 100 years. I was determined to try and get inside Labour's spin machine. And after many years of persistent, both in opposition and in government, of persistent lobbying, in 2000, Blair and Campbell gave us unique access to film the Downing Street media operation. Their calculation was that a fair report would show that number 10 was more spinned against than spinning. That's what they hoped. Campbell said to me, the press, hand in hand with the Conservatives, say that everything we do is just spin. It's all part of their strategy to say you can't trust the Prime Minister, that this guy doesn't really stack up, doesn't stand for anything. We were filming in number 10 in Campbell's office when Tony Blair suddenly walked in.
Would have impressed today's indignant demonstrators.
Look, I just wanted to say on the
He didn't know was filming. Is this all right?
the health we just had with the GPs.
But the Tories make no apologies and say that is an accurate description.
What I want to do, really.
Ludicrous to suggest that serious politicians...
Do you often come to your press secretary's office?
I do if I'm passing, which I happen to be.
So how important is your press secretary to you?
Not at all.
How important is Alistair Campbell to you?
Of course, I mean, the press secretary is important for the Prime Minister. I mean, it would be odd if he wasn't, I think.
Yeah, but this particular...
Yeah, well, I mean, I like to think I've hired the best in the business. I hope I have, anyway. So, yeah, of course. But, a lot of twaddles talked about it as well.
Yeah, but everyone says the importance you put on relations with the media is greater than it's been with any government in the past.
I think it's just modern government now. Look, it's a 24-hour-a-day news media. If a story comes out that says something, and you haven't got the capacity to get on top of it and say, no, hang on, sorry, the facts are X and Y. And as you've probably discovered, I mean, it's not as if, these stories don't take a life of their own and then start running away into the far distance, and then the public thinks, oh my goodness, what on earth are they doing that for when you're not doing it at all? It's important to have the capacity to get on top of the news insofar as it's possible, but it's less important to us than I think it is in the way that people perceive it.
And when they say in the papers who announced the Campbell spend your whole time thinking about how you're going to win the next election, everything is planned and worked out to be spun in that sort of way.
I mean, it's just rubbish. Well, it's like, I was supposed to have spent my holidays with him last year or something. I mean, much as I like him, but no.
So why do you think the press don't believe this? Are they corrosively cynical?
I honestly don't know, and that's for you to do. But what is important for me is that it doesn't disturb me from doing the things that are really important in the end, which are, the things for the country. Otherwise, there's no point in doing this job. And people can believe that or not as they like, but that's what I spend my time thinking of.
So now you just spent 7 minutes talking to Michael Cockerell.
The thing a spin doctor must never do, blow your own client out of the water. I subsequently learned that Campbell wished he'd bitten his tongue. He wrote in his diary, "The only time I cringed in the film was when it looked as if I was taking the piss out of Tony." He was. When I made a TV portrait of David Cameron, who said he was the heir to Blair in terms of using the media, I was struck by the fact that every previous Prime Minister I'd filmed became leader and then got themselves a spin doctor. Cameron was the spin doctor who became Prime Minister, having been a media advisor to a media company. He saw television as crucial to his premiership, and he prioritised his weekly appearances at Prime Minister's Questions. He would prepare diligently with a team of advisors who would come up with clever lines that would sound spontaneous. In his wood-panelled Commons room, I asked Cameron what it was like doing PM Questions. He replied, "There isn't a Wednesday when you don't feel total fear and trepidation about what's going to happen. I'm normally sitting here preparing for PMQs, and about 5 minutes beforehand you think, oh no, have I got to do this again?" I asked Cameron what he thought of the Commons as an institution. He told me, "You do feel a real sense of history in this place. It's half a museum, half a church, and half a school." Funny sort of school, which has 3 halves to make a whole. And we know, of course, which school Cameron went to at the same time as his long-time frenemy, Boris Johnson. I'd long wanted to make a film about Johnson. In 2013, after he'd twice managed to be elected mayor of normally Labour London, after prolonged humming and hawing, Johnson agreed to let me in. The film revealed that Johnson, at the age of 5, had wanted to be world king, but he'd later lowered his sights to becoming British Prime Minister. Johnson saw television as his way to the top. It was the ideal medium for his skills as an entertainer, and he became much in demand as a political clown who could make people laugh. One of my techniques in making political profiles is to film my subjects watching archive clips of their highs and lows in their career. I showed Boris Johnson how he, as London mayor, had prepared for the London Olympics at a rally before the Olympic Games started in Hyde Park.
More gold, silver, bronze medals than you'd need to bail out Greece and Spain together. Final question. Can we put on the greatest Olympic Games that has ever been held in any city? Can we?
Well, I was very lucky to be mayor at the time of the Olympic Games, is all I can say. And it was a jammy old trick to pull.
But what was it like for you to hear that huge crowd chanting, Boris, Boris, Boris?
Very, very bad
people.
for you. I mean, don't do it. I mean, I'm very, very bad for the ego. But you do understand why Roman emperors put on great games and great spectacle. I mean, suddenly you think, wow, this is obviously a big thing. So, you know.
So, I mean, would you like to be a Roman emperor?
No. They invariably came to sticky ends.
He'd fly through the air with the greatest of ease, a daring young man on the flying trapeze. His movements were graceful, for girls he could please, and my love...
A sticky end was the mot juste for Johnson's celebrated trip, which climaxed with the daring young mayor stuck on the zip wire.
I want you to know it's going well. It's very, very well organised. Get me a ladder.
I want you to know that was far more painful and frightening than you might think.
In what way?
Because it was, to start with, it was jolly high up. And after you stuck up there for a while, stuff starts to chafe and so on and so forth.
Well, around your groin?
I don't want to go into these details, Michael. I mean, it was chafing was involved, but...
I thought you wrote in your book.
Did I? Right.
Yeah. So I'm only quoting you, Boris. This is what's so difficult. I quote you.
I can never remember what I've written. Okay.
You said it got very, very tight around your groin area.
Did it? Right. Well, if that's why I wrote in my book, it must be absolutely correct.
If any other politician anywhere in the world got stuck on a zip wire, it would be, disastrous. For Boris, it'll be an absolute triumph. There's no... he defies all forms of gravity.
Chafing in the Groin Area, I thought was a wonderful title for a biography of Boris Johnson. See, he said he couldn't remember he'd said that. He said, but I can never remember what I write. He often writes books which he doesn't even read, because he's got so many researchers doing it. But you could see at the end David Cameron's reluctant admiration of Johnson's Houdini-like skills of escaping from an impossibly tough spot and making people laugh in the process. And when, as Prime Minister, Cameron called the Brexit referendum in 2016, he'd been led to believe that the great campaigner Boris Johnson was a Remainer. Here's a film I made about their relationship.
Should I stay or should I go?
David Cameron admires Boris Johnson's charisma, and he desperately wanted Bojo on his side in the referendum campaign. But Johnson wouldn't make up his mind.
Should I stay or should I go?
In February, he drove to his bolt hole in Oxfordshire, having said he was genuinely conflicted on whether or not to go for Brexit, and was veering all over the place like a supermarket trolley. Johnson was being offered a top cabinet job by Cameron if he joined the Remain campaign. He decided he would use his weekly Daily Telegraph column, for which he's paid $250,000 a year, to help reach his decision.
I've been told by someone in a position to know that you wrote 2 articles for the Daily Telegraph, because you knew you had to have an article in the Daily Telegraph on the Monday. One was for staying in, the other was for getting out. And the person who told me this said that they
one for staying in was the more persuasive?
Well, on the contrary, the one, I don't know what your conceivable sources for that information may be, but I can tell you seriously that I decided that it was much better for our country to go out.
This person said that your arguments for staying in were stronger than the arguments for coming out.
Perhaps, I don't know.
But you did write the two articles.
I certainly, what I can say is that I wrote...
There's a way of helping you make up your mind.
And I'll tell you what the second article said. What it said was that actually, irrespective of my objections to the way the EU was going, in order to support my party and the Prime Minister, it would be better to stay in. And I thought, in the end, that wasn't a good enough reason.
Now, let me say about Boris, I have huge respect for Boris as a politician. He's a great friend of mine. He is a fantastic Mayor of London. I think he's got a lot to give to the Conservative Party. I think he's got a lot to give to this country. But on this issue, I think he's got it wrong. And I think he's reached the wrong conclusion. So we're going to have, I hope, a very reasonable and civilised argument.
It was the latest contest in a relationship between the two men who'd been friends and rivals for nearly 40 years.
We all know what happened there. After the shock leave victory, Cameron announced that he was resigning as Prime Minister. Johnson left it for a few hours and then he texted Cameron, "Dave, I'm so sorry to have been out of touch, but I couldn't think of what to say. And now I'm absolutely miserable about your decision. You've been a superb Prime Minister and leader, and our country owes you eternally." Boris Johnson's 19-year-old nephew, Oliver, told his mother, Rachel, Uncle Boris has just stolen our futures. And Cameron himself said of Johnson, whom he called the greased piglet, "Boris ruined my bloody career." I made films about Johnson's premiership that looked at his record and conduct in office. Here's the opening clip from the film I made, which went out on the night that he finally and very reluctantly threw in the towel in September last year.
6 weeks ago, a Typhoon fighter jet took off from an RAF base in Lincolnshire. Its co-pilot had just announced he was about to become Britain's ex-Prime Minister.
After 3 happy years in the cockpit, and after performing some pretty difficult, if not astonishing, feats, I am now going to hand over the controls seamlessly to someone else. Don't know who.
Boris Johnson believes in the great man theory of history, and he thinks he is that great man, like his hero, Winston Churchill.
Churchill, the guy made the most incredible series of mistakes. His early career was studded with disasters of one kind or another, but he always came back from them, and he always stuck by what he believed.
When Johnson became Prime Minister 3 years ago, Churchill's grandson, Sir Nicholas Soames, his friend and fellow Etonian, told me of the text he had sent.
I said to him, when Churchill became Prime Minister, on the day he became Prime Minister, he went back to his flat where he met my grandmother and his children, and they drank a bottle of champagne. And he proposed a toast, which I quoted to Boris, of "Here's to not buggering it up." And that is my hope for Boris.
And your fear?
My fear is that he could bugger it up.
Throughout his life, Boris Johnson's favoured mode of transport has been the seat of his pants. His roller coaster premiership has been dominated by questions about his character, his integrity, and the biggest puzzle of all, who is the real Boris Johnson?
Get me a ladder.
He is the people person that people want to see as their Prime Minister. They want someone they can relate to, and they can relate to someone who gets stuck on a zip wire, or someone, you know, who has his shirt hanging out, or because that's what they do every day of their lives.
Do you think that you learnt something for later life from acting in plays at Eton, that you could actually get more laughs by looking as if you don't know your lines than actually remembering them?
Well, I certainly think that as a general tactic in life, if that's what you're driving at, it is often useful to give the slight impression that you are deliberately pretending not to know what is going on, because the reality may be that you don't know what is going on, but people won't be able to tell the difference.
It's the most honest answer I've ever heard from a politician. His technique of surrounding himself with a buffer zone of confusion was to contribute to his downfall. His premiership has been like nothing I've ever seen. It resembled a Netflix series penned by a scriptwriter on speed, blending Shakespeare, Monty Python, and The Sopranos. His real-life downfall in Downing Street came in on July 22nd with a sudden rush of resignations by ministers from his government. Topping the list were Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, and the Chancellor Rishi Sunak, both saying they could no longer trust the PM's word or his competence. When Johnson heard they'd gone, one of his closest advisors told me the PM exploded with a barrage of expletives beginning with F and C. My film about Johnson showed what happened next on that July day, as speculation mounted that the Prime Minister was for the chop. The number of departures from across government reached over 60, a record.
Is it all over, Prime Minister? How many resignations will it take?
Simon Hart, are we reaching the end game for Boris Johnson?
I am late for a meeting in number 10.
Late for a meeting in number 10?
And
Simon Hart, the Welsh secretary and long-time Johnson loyalist, went to see the PM in his office at number 10.
Are you going to resign, Mr. Hart?
my final conversation with Boris actually was about, look, whichever way you look, there's somebody, pointing a gun at you. And I remember just saying to Boris, look, if the cabinet doesn't sort of get you, then the backbenchers, the 1922 committee will probably get you. If it's not this week, they'll get you next week. And being Boris, typically it was a case of, but I've got a chance. He said, I can still turn this around. I said, I don't think even you can do this, Prime Minister.
Hart resigned, as did the Prime Minister.
Any regrets, Prime Minister?
And in his final appearance at PMQs, Johnson offered words of advice for his successor.
Focus on the road ahead. Focus on the road ahead, but always remember to check the rear-view mirror. I've helped to get this country through a pandemic and helped save another country from barbarism. And frankly, that's enough to be going on with. Mission largely accomplished. For now, I want to thank everybody here and hasta la vista, baby. Thank you.
Johnson left the chamber to a standing ovation, but only from his own side.
He gets the big decisions absolutely right. Whether it was Ukraine, COVID, vaccines, cost of living support, financial support, got all the big calls right. And I think we'll regret removing him as our Prime Minister. One of our most successful, in fact, our most successful Prime Minister in a generation.
When he uttered those farewell words, hasta la vista, baby, that hint in there that one day you'll see me again. I'm not written off yet. Well, he's certainly not written himself off in his own mind. But my God, Boris, spare us. You did some very considerable things, but you blew it. You ignored the rules, and the rules got you.
Boris is a chancer. He is a chancer. There have been lots of prime ministers who have been chancers. People would have said that of Churchill, that he was a bit of a chancer in his day. But Boris is not Churchill.
Johnson himself was always concerned about his legacy. He once told me why he wanted to move from Fleet Street to Westminster. As he put it, because no one puts up statues to journalists. And so we come full circle in the love-hate relationship that Prime Ministers have had with television. Boris Johnson, who last year was still the Prime Minister of Britain, announced last week that he's now to become a presenter on GBTV News. The man who would never have become Prime Minister without the box now returns to give what he calls his unvarnished views on the flakiest of all the new TV channels. And last week, the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, did a big TV interview But he was the interviewer, and his interviewee was Elon Musk, the tech billionaire. And the interview was first screened on Musk's own TV channel. At the end of the interview, the Prime Minister said it had been a huge privilege to host Elon Musk and patted him on the back as the pair left the stage. It almost looked as if Sunak was auditioning for his next job as a TV host. Right, I'll take any questions you like.
I've got a mic. I'm hoping you've got questions. We've probably got about 10 minutes.
Thank you for that fascinating talk. You might be interested to know that I once revealed to Alistair Campbell that the Chinese Communist Party were actually watching you lately and learning how to do spear and propaganda and timing on.
That's fascinating.
A mixture of bewilderment and flattery, I think, in his response at that event. It's interesting that in the great sweep that you presented, the one character that was missing was Gordon Brown. And I just wondered if you think that he lost the 2010 election partly because of his appearances in the media, that he wasn't really a television age Prime Minister.
Yeah, I do think that. I think that television is a medium of impressions, and the impression that the public had of Gordon Brown was probably right, especially the stories about throwing the mobile phones across the room and all that. But some people the cameras like, and some people they don't like. But the irony, of course, with Gordon Brown is that he started his career as a TV reporter. He wasn't that bad, but I remember for time after time saying he would see me in some conference or something, and he said, you stop doing those documentaries. And I said, yeah, about time I did one with you. And he'd say, that will require a lot of thinking about. And 6 months later, he'd say, you're still doing those documentaries. So about time I did one with you, that'll require a lot of thinking about it. He was still thinking about it when he stopped being Prime Minister. But he was unfortunate, in terms he didn't really, he was a bit like Ted Heath. He thought that just if he said things but didn't make any direct contact with the public he was talking to, that somehow they would listen, but they didn't.
You give us an interesting back look at some quite significant world leaders and some of the Brits as well. As we look across the world today, where have all the people, the stature go? I'm sitting today and we look across the world, and other than the negatives of the Russian leader, there's no real significant world personality that any of us can really identify with. Where are they coming from for the future?
And are you including Great Britain in that? Absolutely. Yeah. It is. I think it's interesting that it would take a long time to answer that properly. But one of the things that has struck me was that when I was at Oxford many years ago, a lot of the brightest and best wanted to go into politics. Now, many of the brightest and best want to go into the media. And if you have a situation where the critics are cleverer and sharper and brighter than the people on the stage, it makes it very difficult for some of these leaders. But I think, look at the American situation. Joe Biden, Sleepy Joe, and Donald Trump, God almighty, I mean, that really is, we had a flash of President Kennedy and even of Bill Clinton, but I don't know. It would take a long time to answer that question.
I was just interested in your sort of experience over the last 60 years in interviewing politicians, whether the length of the question or the length of the answer has sort of increased or reduced in that time.
That is interesting. I often think that the short question, the really short question, can often be the best. And you just say to him, but when, or but why, or something like that. Instead of a lot of the time, I do think that interviewers want to be known for the famous question that they asked, but I would like to be known for the famous answer that I got. And then, so there is that. There is also what I was saying about the spin doctors preparing them, for sound bites that they wanted to get across. I mean, Robin Day was a fascinating figure. You've got some clips of him in the film, and that question to Ted Heath is still one of my favourite questions. Prime Minister, Mr. Heath, how low does your popularity have to sink among your own supporters before you consider yourself a liability to the party you lead? I thought that was a very good question. I have used a sort of version of that question to many prime ministers, and you saw it to Mrs. Thatcher. So it's a seemingly simple question. Do you have any doubts about your ability to fulfil the role of prime minister? Ted Heath said, no doubts at all. Mrs. Thatcher said, do I have any doubts? This was when she had a new voice and everything like that. When I think of some of the men who've done this job, I think that, but I think I could do the job. I think I could give it a go. But Boris said, you would be inhuman if you didn't have doubts about your capabilities. Whereas David Cameron said, if I'd had any doubts, I wouldn't have run for the leadership of the Tory party. So he had no doubts.
My question actually has to do with Harold Wilson. A lot of people credit him as the first modern Prime Minister, the guy who got to understand how to use modern technology to his advantage. A fellow political journalist of your peerage, Steve Richards, said that he's very infashionable, and it's almost like Harold Wilson didn't happen. I was wondering if you agreed with that sentiment, or you believe there's still so much to learn from him, not just as a Prime Minister, but as a great manipulator of the media.
Yeah, he was very skilled. He became very skilled. And interestingly, the person who was his unacknowledged spin doctor was Marcia Falkender, about whom a biography has just recently been written. She was very, very shrewd about how to present him on television. And when I interviewed her, she only did about a couple of interviews in her life. You know, she told me sort of some of the way they dealt with Wilson on camera. She said that one of the first things he did was to make a party political broadcast where he would stress his point with his fist like that, and on the television it looked like the fist was coming through the screen at you. And so she said, we gave him the pipe to smoke during interviews so he wouldn't do that. And then he could put his other hand up to his face, and that would show his wedding ring. And Ted Heath was a bachelor, and we wanted to play that up. So she was shrewd. Any more for any more? Right, last one.
Very simple question. I just wonder, from the filmmaker's point of view, which one was your favourite, or is your favourite? Not from political point of view.
No, I understand exactly.
From the filmmaker's point of view.
Yes, it's very interesting that it's one has kind of mixed views in terms of what one thought of them, and also the way they are when you're filming with them. And some people who have sort of terrible images are actually quite nice, and some people who seem quite nice are actual bastards. So it's quite interesting. So what's the answer to the question? Well, Boris was magic to film in a way. You would see that in terms of, not for the country, but for making a film about it. My mouth would often, my jaw would drop in surprise at how far he was going to go. One other person that I made a films about was the Tory naughty boy Alan Clark, who told me that his girlfriend or his mistress also came on his honeymoon and things like that. Answers that I remember his wife, Jane Clark, is a wonderful woman, and she didn't want to be in the film. She said it's Alan's show. I said, but you're the important figure of this. She said, no, I'm not going to be in it. And then she, one day when we were filming at his castle, he wasn't there, and we were going to do the big interview. So I said, we must try and interview you. And she said, no. I said, can we film anything that you might be doing? And she was, and we saw her, and she'd come out into the lawns with a cocoa tin of grain to feed the peacocks, the way one does. And I started talking to her, and she said, I suggested that Alan has certain peacock-like qualities. And she said, yeah, that we keep these wonderful vintage cars, and we keep them highly polished, and the peacocks often see the shiny vintage cars and fly at them because they think they think that it's a rival. And I suggested that Alan had certain peacock-like qualities, and she said, yes, he is an SH1T, but somehow I love him. I remember once I took an axe, she said, and I threw it at it, and as it was whirring through the air, I hoped it would cleave his skull in two, but it missed. And I was secure, surprisingly pleased about that. And that was, and Alan Clark was just as revealing as that. Anyone else? Last one. Okay.
I was going to take advantage of the fact that someone's put a microphone in my hand and just try and slip in the last question. I can't help thinking, seeing all of those prime ministers, that perhaps Churchill and Macmillan were right about television then, and that perhaps actually it's all been your fault, really. And what we got at the end there, we got with Boris Johnson, we get the culmination and politics becoming entertainment.
Yeah.
Someone is not suited for the role, they go into the role because he entertains people and makes people laugh, and they're able to say, oh, it's just Boris. Is that where we are now?
Well, it's been coming for a long time. It's a lot of it came from America, of course, but it is, for those two things about television to have happened last week, just to give me a last line. But I don't think I'm responsible for it. I'm the one who's been charting it for you so that you can see what has happened. But I've always been absolutely fascinated by that relationship. And it was interesting watching the film what Sir Alec Douglas Hume said. He's almost everyone has forgotten him, but he said, the danger is you'd get the people who are an actor on top of the pops. Certainly that has very much happened in the years since. I mean, I think, you know, what the advertising man, Heath's advertising man said, you know, if you don't put your policies across in a way that people can relate to, you need to use some of the techniques of persuasion advertising, but you don't want to do it in a way that is sort of fake news. But I think every politician is going to look at themselves in the mirror and think, can I do it, and what do I do about it? But you rarely get them being as candid as, say, Mrs. Thatcher was later on, because when I first asked her about how important Gordon Rees was, she said, Gordon Rees, do you know, I think he comes to me for advice rather than the other way around. I'll tell you one Thatcher story. The 1979 general election, Mrs. Thatcher, with her new deep voice, I was filming with her, and I said to her, when I did the sit-down interview, I've been following you through this election campaign, and there sometimes seem to be two Mrs. Thatchers. There's the one doing the walkabouts in the factories and in the street, talking to ordinary people and endlessly fascinated by the minutiae of their lives. And then there's the passionate politician on the platform, full of stirring rhetoric. How many Mrs. Thatchers are there? And she said to me, 3 at least. I said, really? What are the 3? And she said, there's the intellectual one, there's the intuitive one, and there's the one at home. And she said it with such a coquettish way that Robin Day, who was watching this exchange go out, said in the studio, the untold story of the election campaign, Margaret Thatcher is having an affair with Michael Cockerell.
I don't know whether that's an appropriate. But I'm afraid I think we have to. So can we thank Michael for a really fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You've been a great audience. Thank you very much.